It's a $7 million Ferrari, and none of you can make it breathe, William Carter said quietly. But the silence that followed felt louder than a slammed door, the words hanging in the polished glass garage as 20 mechanics avoided his eyes, and the scarlet Ferrari sat motionless beneath white ceiling lights. Its mirror-like, paint-reflecting faces that suddenly looked smaller than their reputations. Laptops glowed on rolling carts. Diagnostic cables snaked across the marble floor, and the faint ticking of cooling metal echoed like a slow clock counting the cost of failure, while William folded his arms, tailored sleeves crisp, jaw tight. The billionaire who built a tech empire, now staring at a machine that refused to obey him. Someone cleared their throat. Another mechanic tapped a keyboard. The lead engineer from Milan adjusted his glasses and said they had replaced the fuel mapping, recalibrated the ECU, checked compression across all 12 cylinders. Yet when he pressed the ignition earlier, the engine only coughed once and fell silent again. A hollow mechanical breath that made the room feel colder. William stepped closer, shoes clicking softly. The Ferrari's hood still open, carbon fiber panels exposed like a surgical patient. You flew in from Italy, billed me $40,000 for the weekend, and it still won't start, he said, not raising his voice, which somehow made everyone more uncomfortable. Outside the glass wall, the late afternoon sun burned gold across the hills of Bel Air, palm trees swaying gently, the calm outside contrasting the tension inside. A faint smell of warm oil and leather hung in the air. One assistant whispered into a phone about another specialist arriving within the hour. Another rolled in a case of tools worth more than most cars. Yet the Ferrari remained silent, its prancing horse emblem catching the light, as if mocking them. William exhaled slowly and rested his palm against the roof. The metal cooled despite the heat of the day. Millions, he murmured, almost to himself, and it still won't breathe. The mechanics shifted, uncertain whether to speak. The engineer gestured toward the ignition, suggesting one more attempt. William nodded once, and the key turned. The starter whirred, a strained mechanical spin, then a dull choke, like a throat closing, and nothing. The sound died instantly, leaving only the faint hum of overhead lights. Someone muttered that it made no sense, another suggested shipping the entire powertrain back to Maranello. William stepped back, expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the silent machine, as if expecting it to answer him. Outside, a black sedan pulled into the driveway, staff moving quietly, the day continuing as normal for everyone except the men gathered around a car that refused to come alive. And as the silence stretched, the billionaire's voice returned, softer now but sharper. You'd think with all this expertise, he said, glancing across the room, someone would hear what it's trying to say. No one replied, and the Ferrari sat perfectly still, the light shifting across its red curves, waiting. The mechanics dispersed slowly, their polished tool cases closing with soft clicks while the Ferrari remained under the white lights like a museum piece that had forgotten its purpose. And beyond the glass wall, a small figure paused near the edge of the driveway. A boy standing beside a rolling cart stacked with folded towels and bottles of interior cleaner, his sneakers slightly worn. His eyes fixed not on the house, but on the open engine bay glowing under the lamps. Angela Reed pushed the cart gently and murmured for him to keep moving, her voice careful, respectful, the tone of someone who worked inside rooms that were never hers. But the boy lingered 1 second longer, watching the men step away from the car, absorbing the silence they left behind. The faint tick of cooling metal seemed louder from where he stood, and he tilted his head as if listening to something no one else had noticed. Angela touched his shoulder and guided him forward, the wheels of the cart humming softly over the smooth stone floor as they entered through the side door. The smell of leather and polish replaced the scent of oil, yet the garage remained visible through the wide interior windows. The red car, shining like a quiet question. The boy slowed again, eyes tracing the intake vents, the loosened clamps, the diagnostic cables still draped like forgotten vines. Angela whispered that they needed to finish before sunset, reminding him they were not supposed to wander. He nodded, but his attention stayed fixed on the machine. Inside the garage, one assistant checked his watch and spoke about scheduling another shipment of parts. Someone mentioned flying in a specialist from Chicago. Another suggested draining the fuel system entirely. Their voices carried faintly through the glass. calm but tired. The boy watched the reflections shift across the Ferrari's curved hood. Then he leaned slightly closer to the window, his expression thoughtful rather than curious, as if he were trying to match a memory to the quiet in front of him. Angela began wiping a console table nearby, the cloth moving in slow circles, the afternoon light turning amber across the polished floor. And for a moment the garage fell completely silent again. No typing, no tools, only the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant rustle of palm leaves outside. The boy's eyes flicked to the exhaust, then back to the open hood. His lips parted as though forming a thought he did not intend to say aloud. He shifted his weight, listening, studying, the stillness of the Ferrari holding his attention longer than anything else in the room. And while the adults discussed invoices and logistics, he remained by the glass, quiet, patient, as if waiting for the car to speak first. One of the engineers returned with a tablet and knelt beside the front wheel, scrolling through graphs that meant little without the sound they were supposed to explain. Another technician reconnected a cable and suggested checking airflow values again, their voices low and professional, but edged with uncertainty. William Carter stood a few feet away watching without interrupting, the sleeves of his charcoal jacket pushed back slightly, his attention sharp yet tired. He had seen this pattern before, experts repeating careful steps that led nowhere. The late afternoon light shifted across the garage floor, and when the ignition was pressed again, the starter spun with a dry mechanical were followed by the same brief choke, a shallow attempt that faded instantly, the silence afterward heavier than before. The engineer frowned and tapped his screen, saying the readings were normal. Someone else proposed swapping sensors one by one. Another began listing parts already replaced: fuel pump, ignition coils, throttle body, each item sounding expensive and final. Yet the car remained still. Beyond the glass, Angela continued working quietly while the boy remained near the window, his eyes narrowing slightly when the engine coughed. He tilted his head again, as if measuring the length of the sound. His gaze moved from the intake to the dashboard reflections, then to the narrow space beneath the hood where a clamp sat slightly misaligned. He shifted closer to the glass without realizing it, his fingers resting lightly against the surface. Inside the garage, the assistant mentioned ordering another shipment overnight, and William exhaled slowly, the patience in his posture thinning. He stepped closer and asked for one more attempt. The key turned, the starter engaged, the same strange spin, then the hollow stop, and the boy's lips parted before he could stop himself. "It sounds like it cannot get enough air," he said softly, the words almost lost in the room. Angela glanced down at him quickly, whispering that they should keep moving, but his eyes stayed on the Ferrari, like something is holding its breath. He added, still quiet, his tone thoughtful rather than certain. One technician near the door heard the voice and looked toward the glass, then back to his screen with a faint smile that suggested polite dismissal. Inside the garage, another mechanic continued discussing pressure readings, unaware of the comment. While William's gaze remained fixed on the car, the reflection of the boy barely visible in the polished red paint. The room returned to its low murmur, tools shifted, keyboards tapped, and the Ferrari sat motionless again. Yet the boy did not move, still watching, still listening, as if the silence itself carried a clue waiting to be understood. The comment dissolved into the background of professional voices, and within minutes another specialist arrived carrying a silver case stamped with airline tags. He introduced himself quietly and moved straight to the Ferrari, the lid of the case opening to reveal precision tools arranged in foam. He connected a fresh diagnostic module and asked for a full system reset. The overhead lights reflected sharply across the red paint as everyone gathered again. William Carter watched without speaking, his posture still, his expression unreadable. The ignition was pressed once more. The starter spun with the same dry insistence. A brief mechanical cough, then silence. The new specialist frowned and leaned closer, scrolling through data. He muttered that airflow numbers looked inconsistent, but not enough to prevent ignition. Another mechanic suggested recalibrating again. Someone else proposed replacing the intake assembly entirely. Numbers were mentioned quietly: thousands for shipping, thousands for labor, time estimates stretching into days. The conversation became a careful cascade of expensive possibilities. Outside the glass, the boy shifted slightly, his attention fixed on the narrow gap Near the intake where the light caught a faint shadow, he watched the mechanics discuss replacing parts that still looked new, his brow tightening. Angela finished wiping the table and gently tugged his sleeve, reminding him they should move to the next room. But he lingered one more moment, his eyes tracking the technician's hand as it hovered over the intake sensors. Inside the garage, William finally spoke, asking how many more attempts they planned to make tonight. The engineer replied that they would continue until they isolated the issue. Though his tone suggested uncertainty, another ignition attempt followed. The engine turned, the same shallow choke, the same immediate stillness. The sound ended so quickly it felt unfinished. The boy exhaled softly, almost in sympathy. "It is trying," he murmured, barely audible. "But something is closing it." Angela glanced around, concerned someone might hear. But the mechanics remained absorbed in their screens. One of them suggested disconnecting the intake entirely. Another hesitated, worried about recalibration delays. The debate circled without resolution. The late sun dipped lower, casting long reflections across the marble floor. The Ferrari remained silent, polished and perfect yet unmoving. And as the specialists discussed ordering a complete intake replacement, the boy's gaze stayed steady, his expression thoughtful, as though the answer was simple but hidden beneath the noise of expertise. And the garage filled again with quiet voices, expensive plans, and the faint ticking of a machine still waiting to breathe. The discussion slowed as the specialists began packing away tools they no longer believed would help tonight. One of them suggested pausing until new parts arrived in the morning. Another nodded, already closing his laptop. The Ferrari remained under the lights, silent and immaculate, its open hood catching the last warm glow of sunset filtering through the glass wall. William Carter stood beside it with a stillness that suggested calculation rather than frustration. He glanced at the intake assembly again, then at the technicians, and finally toward the glass where reflections blurred the view of the interior. Angela guided the cleaning cart toward the exit, but the boy hesitated once more, his eyes locked on the small misaligned clamp near the intake. He leaned slightly forward, studying the narrow gap. The way the rubber edge seemed pressed unevenly, his expression focused, thoughtful, as if matching sound to shape. Angela whispered gently that they should leave, reminding him they were already behind schedule. He nodded, but did not move immediately. Inside the garage, the assistant mentioned rescheduling the entire team for early morning, and someone else spoke about draining the fuel lines overnight. William exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple, then spoke in a low voice that carried across the quiet room, asking if anyone had considered airflow restriction beyond the sensors. The lead engineer replied that they had checked everything electronically, though not fully disassembling the intake. Another mechanic suggested that would take hours, and the room fell into a pause. Outside the glass, the boy's voice slipped out softly, almost a whisper. "It just needs space to breathe." Angela looked down at him quickly, but the words had already floated into the quiet. One technician near the door glanced over with a faint amused expression, then returned to closing his case. The comment sounded too simple compared to the complex explanations filling the room. William's eyes shifted briefly toward the reflection again, then back to the car. He rested his hand lightly on the fender, the polished surface cool beneath his palm. The boy remained still, watching the intake as though expecting it to answer. The last sunlight faded, and the overhead lights brightened automatically, turning the Ferrari into a glowing centerpiece. And as the specialists prepared to step away for the evening, the silence returned once more, the car unmoving, the air still, and the quiet suggestion lingering in the room like a thought no one had yet decided to follow. The specialists began to step back from the Ferrari, their cases closed, conversations drifting toward schedules and flights, and the garage settled into a quiet that felt unfinished. William Carter remained beside the car, his gaze lingering on the intake assembly, the polished metal reflecting the overhead lights in clean lines. He did not move for several seconds, as if replaying the last few attempts in his mind. Then he turned slightly toward the glass wall, the reflection of the boy still visible, small and patient. Angela guided the cleaning cart toward the hallway, but the boy paused again, his attention fixed on the same narrow gap near the intake. He leaned closer, studying the angle of the clamp, the way the rubber edge pressed unevenly against the housing. His brow tightened, and without meaning to, He raised his hand slightly as if tracing the shape in the air. Inside the garage, one mechanic mentioned they would resume in the morning. Another suggested covering the car for the night. But William did not answer. He stepped forward and looked more closely at the intake, following the line of components with his eyes. The room quieted again. Sensing his focus, the boy spoke softly, almost apologetically. "If it cannot pull air, it cannot wake up." Angela whispered for him to keep his voice down, yet the words drifted across the stillness. One technician glanced over with a polite half-smile, interpreting it as a child's observation, then returned to his notes. William's hand rested lightly on the fender, his fingers still. He glanced once more toward the glass, not directly at the boy, but at the reflection, then back to the intake. The suggestion seemed too simple compared to the layers of diagnostics already performed. Yet the silence around the car made simplicity harder to dismiss. He asked quietly whether the intake had been physically inspected for obstruction. The lead engineer replied that sensors showed normal readings, though they had not fully loosened the clamp since installation. Another mechanic added that removing it now would take only a few minutes, but might require recalibration afterward. The conversation slowed, uncertainty replacing routine confidence. The boy watched intently, his posture calm, as if waiting for someone to notice what he saw. The overhead lights brightened slightly. As evening settled outside, reflections sharpened across the red paint, and the Ferrari remained perfectly still. Yet the room felt different now, the possibility of a small, overlooked detail hovering in the air. William finally nodded once, not a command, just a quiet permission to look again, and the mechanics hesitated, exchanging brief glances before one of them stepped forward toward the intake, while the boy remained by the glass, silent, listening, as though the next sound would finally answer the question. The mechanic stepped forward and loosened the clamp carefully, the metal ring turning with a soft click that sounded louder in the quiet room. He lifted the intake hose slightly and paused, peering inside while another technician angled a light closer. The beam revealed a narrow fold along the rubber edge, subtle but enough to narrow the opening. The mechanic frowned and adjusted his grip, easing the hose back into position, aligning it more evenly against the housing. The motion was small, almost delicate, and for a moment no one spoke. William Carter watched intently, his eyes following the movement as if weighing every second. The clamp tightened again with a gentle turn. The mechanic wiped his hands and stepped back, saying it had been slightly pinched, but probably not enough to cause a full stall. Yet the room felt different now, as though the possibility had shifted the air. William nodded once and asked for another attempt. The ignition button was pressed. The starter spun, the same mechanical whir, but this time the engine caught for half a second longer, a deeper vibration pulsing through the chassis before fading again. The sound surprised everyone, subtle but unmistakably different. The mechanic glanced at the intake, then back at the dashboard. Someone murmured that it sounded closer. Another suggested checking airflow values again. The boy outside the glass leaned forward slightly, his eyes brightening. He listened to the brief vibration as though confirming a thought. Inside the garage, the mechanic loosened the clamp once more, this time adjusting the hose more carefully, rotating it by a fraction of an inch, ensuring the rubber edge sat flush. The light reflected along the curve, showing a smoother line. He tightened the clamp again, stepped back, and nodded. William gestured quietly for another attempt. The ignition engaged, the starter spun, then the engine caught. A low rumble building into a full, clean roar that filled the garage. The sudden sound vibrated through the floor, the Ferrari finally breathing, smooth and steady. The technicians froze for a second, surprised by the simplicity of the change. The engine settled into a refined idle, the polished red body trembling gently under the rhythm. Outside the glass, the boy exhaled softly, almost relieved. Angela looked down at him, then back at the garage. The mechanics exchanged glances, one of them checking the readings, confirming stable airflow. William stood still beside the car, listening to the sound, his expression calm but altered, as if the noise itself had rewritten the evening. The Ferrari idled smoothly, the long silence replaced by a steady mechanical heartbeat, and in the reflection of the hood, the small figure by the glass remained watching, quiet, as the machine finally breathed. The engine continued to idle smoothly, the the steady rhythm filling the garage with a sound that felt almost unreal after hours of silence. The technicians moved closer, watching the readings stabilize. One of them nodded slowly as airflow numbers settled into normal range. Another closed his tablet with a quiet breath of relief. The Ferrari's red body shimmered under the lights, the polished surfaces reflecting the calm that had replaced tension. William Carter remained beside the car, listening, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant, as if he were measuring the difference between complexity and a small adjustment that had changed everything. Outside the glass, the boy stood still, his shoulders relaxed now, his attention still fixed on the engine as though confirming it would continue breathing. Angela gently placed a hand on the cart handle, ready to move on, but she noticed William's gaze shift toward the reflection again, this time more deliberately. He studied the faint outline of the boy in the paint, then looked past the car toward the glass wall. The mechanics continued discussing recalibration logs. Unaware of the quiet exchange, William stepped away from the Ferrari and walked toward the glass, his shoes soft against the floor. Angela straightened slightly, unsure whether to move or wait. The boy looked up, surprised but calm. William stopped a few feet away, the hum of the engine still audible behind him. He asked quietly if the boy had noticed something earlier, the question simple, without accusation or disbelief. The boy nodded once, glancing back at the intake. It sounded like it was trying, but could not pull air, he said, his voice careful. Angela added softly that he liked listening to engines, explaining that he spent time helping neighbors fix lawn equipment and old generators. The boy looked down briefly, then back at the car. Sometimes they just need space, he said, not as a claim, but as an observation. William studied him for a moment. The contrast between the quiet child and the expensive machine behind him impossible to ignore. The engine continued its steady rhythm, warm air moving gently through the garage. The technicians finally stepped back, satisfied the issue was resolved. One of them remarked that such a small misalignment could easily be overlooked. Another nodded, already documenting the correction. William turned slightly, listening again to the Ferrari, then back to the boy, the silence between them calm, thoughtful, as though the evening had shifted in a direction no one expected, and the car continued to idle smoothly, its sound filling the space while the small observation that led to it lingered quietly in the air. The Ferrari continued to idle with a smooth, confident rhythm, the sound steady and refined, filling the garage with a calm that had been missing all afternoon. The technicians began gathering their equipment with quieter movements now, their earlier urgency replaced by measured professionalism. One of them noted the corrected airflow values while another documented the alignment change. William Carter remained near the glass, his attention shifting between the car and the boy. The contrast lingered in the air, polished carbon fiber and marble on one side, a cleaning cart and worn sneakers on the other. Angela rested her hands lightly on the cart handle, unsure whether to move. William finally spoke, his voice low but clear, asking the boy what his name was. The boy answered softly, "Marcus," and glanced briefly at the Ferrari before meeting William's eyes again. William nodded once, then asked how he learned to listen to engines that way. Marcus explained carefully that he helped neighbors fix lawn mowers, small generators, and an old pickup truck that stalled whenever it ran too rich. He said sometimes machines sounded different even when numbers looked normal, and he liked figuring out why. His tone simple, not proud, just matter of fact. The engine behind them continued its steady idle, warm air drifting gently across the polished floor. William looked back at the car, then toward the intake where the small adjustment had changed everything. He exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging how easily experience could overlook something quiet. The technicians finished packing, and one of them complimented the smooth idle. Another confirmed no further issues. The garage lights reflected evenly across the red paint, the Ferrari now alive in a way it had not been all day. William stepped aside slightly and gestured toward the car, inviting Marcus to look closer if he wanted. Angela hesitated, but Marcus approached carefully, stopping a respectful distance away, his eyes studying the engine bay with quiet fascination, the sound of the idling motor steady and clean. William watched him for a moment, then said that sometimes the smallest observations mattered more than the most expensive solutions. The words calm, reflective, not directed at anyone in particular. Marcus nodded lightly, still focused on the machine. The technicians exited one by one, their footsteps fading, leaving the garage quieter except for the engine's rhythm. Outside, the sky darkened into evening, the glass walls reflecting the lights and the living machine at the center. William turned back toward Marcus and Angela, his expression thoughtful, as though the afternoon had shifted something subtle. The Ferrari continued to idle smoothly, no longer silent, and the steady sound carried through the space, marking the end of a problem solved by patience, listening, and a voice that had nearly gone unnoticed.